Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Please allow a minute while people are still joining the room. We will begin shortly. Just a few more seconds while people are still joining the room. All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar co-hosted by the Department of Buildings and ASHRAE New York City. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, we had an impressive 500 people register for today's webinar, and we appreciate the great interest in this topic. Right now, we are at around 200 attendees, and people are still joining the room. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time because we are again on a very tight schedule today. So while people are joining, I would like to briefly introduce this webinar series for those of you who are joining us for the first time. And as you may know, the Department of Buildings is working closely with ASHRAE New York City to deliver a series of webinars for sustainability service providers to share important information on the basics of Local Law 97. We've put this event together because we are aware of the great growing demand for this kind of educational program in light of new legislation. And this is another event in a series of webinars, which we will be hosting virtually on this platform every few weeks. So please stay tuned for future announcements. We will be sharing updates on the upcoming events in the coming days. And once we finalize the dates of the future webinars and open registration, we will send email updates ahead of each event. Next, before I introduce our speakers, I want to cover a couple housekeeping items. First, for your awareness, we record this presentation. Second, we wanted to encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat window. So please take a moment to locate the chat window on your control panel. We will have a brief Q&A session after the presentation where our speakers along with the DOB team will be answering those questions. Additionally, we are glad to offer 1 PDH and 1 AIA credit for this event. And for those who are requesting PDH, we will share a link to the form in the chat in a minute. So that's the regular process. And for those of you who would like to obtain AIA credit, please type in AIA followed by your name in the chat. So again, for the PDH credit, please fill out the form. The link should be in the chat in a second. And if you are requesting AIA credit, please type in your name and your email address in the chat window. We are also getting a lot of questions about the slides, and the answer is yes. We will be sharing the slides after the presentation. If you have any questions, any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to education@ashraeny.org. And so finally, please allow me to introduce our speakers. We have Emily Hoffman and Jean Kim here with us today. Emily Hoffman is currently serving as the Director of Buildings, Energy and Emissions Performance at NYC Department of Buildings and will oversee the implementation of Local Law 97 in New York City. Prior to this role, Emily served for nearly 10 years as the Director of Energy Code Compliance for the ODB. She led the first NYC-wide Energy Code Compliance program that has ensured compliance for over 20,000 new buildings to date, and updated the NICEC over 3 code cycles to nearly 30% energy savings. Emily is also heavily involved in local and national energy code development, leading the development of the NICEC IECC and participating in the development of ASHRAE 90.1, 229P and NYSERDA stretch code. Emily was awarded the Energy Professional Development of the Year Award in 2019 and 2020 from the Association of Engineers. Her team won the Green Builder Sustainability Award for the category Large Municipality in 2019, and she was named an NYC Climate Hero in 2020. Jean Kim serves as the Deputy Director of Building Energy and Emissions Audits at the NYC Department of Buildings. As a core member of the NYC Local Law 97 implementation team in the department, Jean is fully involved in developing the operational procedures, platforms, and instruments to administer Local Law 97 and to streamline the existing sustainability laws. Bringing her prior experience in implementing the NYC Energy Conservation Code across 3 code versions, 2014, 2016, and 2020, NYC ECC, Jean will lead the team of building energy and emissions auditors tasked with enforcing Local Law 97 and related laws. Prior to joining the department, Jean held executive positions in the private sector, such as senior principal at architectural firms in NYC and abroad. Her achievements include founding and managing an award-winning architectural firm in NYC and overseeing large-scale internationally collaborated architectural projects. Jean is a registered architect, lead AP, BDNC, certified energy manager, and certified passive house designer. Finally, Jean earned her master's degree in design and environmental analysis from Cornell University. We also have Denise with NYC Accelerator Services, service provider program here with us, and she will say a few things about the NYC Accelerator. And then after Denise, we will have Emily and present on today's topic. All right, so now let's welcome Emily, Jean, and Denise and find out what they would like to share with us today. Emily, Jean, and Denise, thank you so much for joining us today, and the virtual floor is now all yours.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you to ASHRAE New York City and to DOB for allowing us to participate in your webinar today. We are grateful. I am going to just go off camera real quick while I do my little presentation here. So I am the service provider with New York City Accelerator Service Provider Program. And I just was going to share a brief overview of the service provider program, and you can go to the next slide. So what is New York City Accelerator? This is a question we get asked often. We are a city program. We are with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, and the program was designed to help building stakeholders control their costs, meet local law compliance, boost building performance, increase their energy savings, and the main focus is to help building stakeholders reduce their carbon emissions across New York City buildings. We are a free program. Again, we provide free technical guidance to help the market accelerate the transformation of how our buildings are being built and operated. We do work with building stakeholders throughout the 5 boroughs with new construction projects as well as existing building projects. We have a team of account managers, about 35 members on that team that will help building stakeholders identify building upgrade projects that will help that building stakeholder meet emissions that have been the emission limits that have been established by Local Law 97 of the CMA Act. And we also provide no-cost trainings, and we also support green workforce development. So we have a main focus on building emissions because this makes up about 70% of the city's pollution, and this is why we're primarily focused just on the building emissions. And you can go to the next slide, please. So New York City Accelerator also has a service provider program, and the role of the service provider program is for the account managers to actively refer building owners, facility managers, property managers, any type of building stakeholder to the companies that are in our New York City Accelerator service provider network. We help building stakeholders and service providers. We encourage them and enhance them for market transformation in the city. We also support job creation, workforce development, economic opportunity, and with a big focus on MWBE engagement. So we're looking to build the service provider sector to accelerate the implementation of these decarbonization projects, and we do seek the help of service providers. So when an organization does become a New York City Accelerator service provider, we view that service provider as an extension of New York City Accelerator's outreach team. You can go to the next slide, please. One of the benefits to being a service provider with New York City Accelerator is you will get to grow your business through referrals from New York City Accelerator. As I mentioned earlier, referrals to building stakeholders are only for the service providers that are in our network. You'll also earn inclusion in New York City Accelerator service provider lookup tool, which is shown here on this screen here. And you can go to the next slide, please. You'll also have access to our entire bench of account managers, expand skills, and grow your team. You'll also be invited to participate in New York City Accelerator's networking events and any trainings that we do hold. And we also will provide access to our financing and solar specialists. One of the things that I don't think is on this slide is we do provide our service providers with a full marketing toolkit and a financing toolkit as well. So you can go to the next slide. So if you are a service provider and you are not yet part of New York City Accelerator Service Provider Program, we would love to have you join us. Simply reach out to me. You can email me at Denise at LXaccelerator.nyc. I do hold a virtual information session every Thursday at 11 a.m. and you can click on that link, or you can just email me again at denise@accelerator.nyc. Express your interest and I will send you a link and invite you to the virtual information session. Thank you. That's it. I think that's the last slide. Yep. So thank you again. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this presentation today. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Denise. Today, Jean, Kim, and I are going to talk about Local Law 97, specifically about how to calculate building emissions and building emission limits. Next slide. This course is approved by AIA. If you haven't seen in the chat, to request these AIA credits, you need to type your name and email in the chat, and you must stay for the entire duration. Next slide. These are the obligatory AIA slides. Next slide, please. Next slide. These are the learning objectives. Like I said, these are specifics on how to identify compliance pathways and calculate, essentially the building emissions, the annual building emissions and the annual building emission limits. Next slide. All right, so we will start off with the timeline of Local Law 97, just quickly. The law passed in 2019. Everything that is in red to the left of this timeline you see are things that we've already completed in the department. There was an advisory board. Many of you participated on that. It was, many stakeholders from the industry that culminated in an advisory board report. And a lot of these recommendations were, rolled into Rule 103-14 that was published January of 2023. So that was our first rule package. DOB also put out another rule package December of 2023. These were amendments to 103-14 and a rule for Article 321. In January of this year, we released an Article 321 filing guide, and just last month, templates for that filing guide, and we are anticipating releasing an Article 320 filing guide very soon, hopefully next month. And then just want to, highlight the way that Local Law 97 is laid out. I think many of you know this. In the first compliance period, which we are in the middle of right now, with the reports being due May 1st of next year, we have emission limits set for that first compliance period. And based on prior benchmarking data, we're seeing that approximately 90% of buildings are in compliance with those limits already. 2030, the emission limits drop significantly in that second compliance period. That's the yellow you see on the screen. And based on prior benchmarking data, we're seeing that approximately 70% of buildings are non-compliant at this point. So that means, we kind of have this ramp up period for the first 5 years, and then it becomes more aggressive in 2030. And then every 5 years, those limits drop significantly. Next slide. So Local Law 97, like I was mentioning, is broken down into two compliance categories, essentially. There's Article 320 and Article 321. So Article 320 is for most private sector buildings and certain, affordable housing. Article 321 is for very specific types of affordable housing buildings and houses of worship. So today, we're just going to talk about Article 320 and calculating the annual emissions and emission limits related to that article. Next slide. If you're not familiar, this is just a little bit about the different compliance pathways for Article 320 that you see circled. These are the annual reports that need to be filed by May 1st every year, starting next year. It's approximately 34,000 buildings. And these are the buildings that over time will have to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 and meet those, periodically every 5 years, those emission limits will drop, and, the buildings will have to, that's the trajectory that they'll have to maintain that compliance. Article 321, which we're not getting into today, that's a one-time report due next year. I think our next service provider training will focus on Article 321. And I just want to mention that city buildings in NYCHA are still subject to Local Law 97 on a portfolio-wide basis. However, those buildings are not reported to DOB, and we don't have the oversight. That's with DCAS and NYCHA. Next slide. All right, and I also wanted to mention another thing that, the historic sustainability laws, benchmarking, energy audits and retrocommissioning, they have been enforced on the lot level at the BBL level. But Local Law 97, we're transitioning over to compliance on the building level. And that's important for a variety of reasons. I think, a lot of the industry is used to reporting on the lot level, but this law is written differently, and so we need to enforce it, according to each building. So we'll also be making that transition with the other sustainability laws, in the next year as Local Law 97 reports become due. So this slide is just a visual of a lot, which is the gray portion, with multiple buildings on a lot, and how each building would be treated differently under Local Law 97. So here, the lot, if we look at all of the gross square footage of each building on the lot, if that's over 50,000 square feet, all of the buildings on the lot become subject to Local Law 97. In this example, we'd say, we look at building 1, and that would be determined to be under Article 321, and that building would be subject to annual reporting due, the first report being due next year, May 1st, 2025. On this, theoretical lot, we have building number 2, which is a city-supported cultural institutions group, and that is accepted from Local Law 97. So that building would have no obligation to report to Local Law 97, because it is an exemption in the law. And then we look at buildings 3 and 4, and in this example, those two follow Article 321, and they're choosing the prescriptive pathway. So they would be able to, submit just a one-time report to us showing that all of those prescriptive pathways are met, and that could be a combined report. So this lot would have to submit 2 reports to us, one for Article 320, one for Article 321. The one with Article 321 could combine these 2 pathways together. Next slide. All right, and I'm passing over to Jean now to talk through a little bit more.
Thank you, Emily. So one of the first questions building owners would ask is my building subject to Local 97 requirements? And the quick answer to that is yes, Local 97 applies if your building is covered building. So what do we mean by covered building? We have definition in Article 320, and we have also covered building definition under Article 321 as well. So they are different. So please note that covered building definitions are different from Article 320 from Article 321. For Article 320 covered buildings, let's read the definition together. The covered building is in the records of the Department of Finance, a building that exceeds 25,000 gross square feet, or two or more buildings on the same tax lot that together exceed 50,000 gross square feet. So the site diagram on the right shows a single building on one tax lot. It is over 25,000 gross square feet. So this building is covered building. We have exceptions. So even though the building is over 25,000 gross square feet, if the building is industrial facility or there are multiple buildings, but if you look at the exception, we call this garden style apartments. So if your buildings are like that, they are accepted. And number 3, a city-owned building. Number 4 is a NYCHA building. And then number 5 and 6 are actually Article 321 building. So if you remember that 3-column table Emily showed us earlier, the city-owned building, the NYCHA building on the far right column is aligned with this exception 3 and 4, and the one in the middle, Article 321 building, is the exception 5 and 6 under this Article 320 covered building. So that was the single building on a single lot, and let's look at the multiple buildings on the same tax lot. Can we have the next slide, please? So here, let's look at the top site diagram. There are 3 buildings. Building 1 alone is 26,000 gross square feet. So that alone is a covered building for sure. But we have to look at the other buildings as well. Building 2 is only 10,000 gross square feet. Building 3 is also 10,000 gross square feet. So altogether, combined, the total gross square feet is 46,000 square feet, which is less than 50,000 square feet. So if that's the case, building 1 only is covered building in the top side diagram. At the bottom diagram, we have at the same 3 buildings, but now building 2 is now bigger. So when 3 buildings are combined, 26,000, 15,000, and 10,000 combined, their total gross square footage is 51,000 square feet, which is greater than 50,000 square feet. In this site, with these 3 buildings, all 3 buildings are covered buildings. So building 1 is definitely over 25,000 square feet by itself. So it is already covered building, but building 2 and 3, they are relatively small. Building 3 is only 10,000 gross square feet, but they are on the same tax lot, and when they are combined, excuse me, they're over 50,000 square feet. So in this case, not only the building 1, but building 2 and building 3 are covered buildings. So building emissions report have to be submitted for all 3 buildings if they are Article 320 buildings. Can we have the next slide? So now we understand that whether a building is or a group of buildings on a tax lot are covered buildings or not is primarily determined by the building's gross square footage. And then who determines building's gross square feet in terms of Local 97 implementation? That's Department of Finance, New York City, DOF. So New York City Department of Finance has record of gross square feet on all the buildings on a lot, or BBL. BBL stands for Borough, Block, and Lot. And DOF has all these records, and DOB has put together covered buildings list for building owners' convenience. So if you click on the link in the middle, in the blue text, that's where you can find the covered buildings list under Article 320, Article 321. They're all separate. And then so if you pull that information from our website, it will look like the list on the right. So calendar year 2024, the local law 97 covered building lists are shown like that. So BBL number, address, borough, and zip code. Talking about the BBL, just for your information, they are 10-digit tax lot ID numbers that DOF assigned for tax properties. So out of the 10-digit, the first digit indicates borough code. So number 1 indicates Manhattan, number 2 is Bronx, number 3 Brooklyn, number 4 Queens, and 5 is Staten Island. And then the next 5 digits indicate the block number, and the last 4 digits indicate the lot number. When the building owners find their building from the covered list, and if they believe their building is not anywhere near 25,000 square feet as a single building, or as combined, it's not over 50,000 square feet, they can start a dispute process. We have that dispute process listed in that same website we have in the middle, and we have captured the image there. So you can contact the Department of Finance by emailing them and ask them to, we can start dispute and get the result from them. Can we get the next slides? So now we need to understand definition of gross floor area as compared to gross square footage. We have a separate definition of gross floor area in RCNY 103-14. Let's just read it together really quick. Gross floor area, according to the RCNY 103-14, is the total area in square feet of all floors and spaces in a covered building as measured between the exterior surfaces of the enclosing fixed walls. Gross floor area includes vent shafts, elevator shafts, flues, pipe shafts, vertical ducts, stairwells, light wells, basement space, cellar space, mechanical electrical rooms, and interior parking. Gross floor area does not include unroofed courtyards or unroofed light wells. For atria, gross floor area only includes the area of atrium floors. For the purpose of calculating gross floor area in tenant spaces, interior demising walls should be measured from to the center line of the wall. So that's the specific definition of gross floor area for RCNY 103-14, that is for local law 97. So why is it important? Because we are using this directly to calculate buildings' greenhouse gas emissions limit. And these numbers are almost always not matching DOF's gross square feet. So please note that there is always some discrepancy. But when, again, each building, when they submit the building's emissions report, their calculations have to be based upon gross floor area of the building. And then registered design professional who's helping out the building owners for the building emissions report, they are responsible for determining the gross floor area. So with that, I'm turning over this to, no, I have another scenario, slide, sorry. Can I have a next one, please? Okay, so now let's take a look at the scenario. So this scenario is, there are multiple buildings, actually 2 buildings on the same tax lot, and they share energy service. By that, what we mean is that the buildings share a meter or other point of connection to the energy supply or energy distribution system. So if you look at the top diagram, two buildings are fed from one connection point of natural gas and also utility electricity. So there may be, like, there's a one main meter for natural gas and some meters for electricity, but they are basically, the connection point is the same. So in this case, and they're the same tax lot by the same owner, they share energy service and they could submit combined report only if the building 1 and building 2 follow the same Local Law 97 compliance pathway. There was a slide 9 earlier. Emily explained extensively. So some buildings are subject to Article 321, and this Article 321 buildings share the energy service with Article 320 building. They cannot combine the report. Their report has to be separate. So it's only when building 1 and building 2 are the buildings subject to Article 320, then they could submit combined report. I said combined report, but the calculations still have to be in bin level, the building identification number level. So each individual building's energy use, their emissions over a year, and the emissions limit for a year, they have to be calculated separately. So if you look at the bottom diagram, building 1 and 2, there is a one main meter for the gas, and only building 1 has the sub meter, and building 2 doesn't have the meter. But if this is the case, we can easily figure out building 2's natural gas use is 2 therms. But sometimes there are no sub meters. There is only 1 meter, and through that 1 meter, the natural gas is fed to different buildings. So if that's the case, we need RDP's effort in that. So the registered design professional, they need to come up with the methodology. So use their professional knowledge and skills to come up with the calculation methodology to assign the energy use of each building before they submit the emissions report. And I think, yeah, with that, I can turn this over to Emily. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jean. And next slide. Okay, so Jean explained, we've set it up so far that I think it's understood that each building is required to generate their own emissions limit and figure out their annual GHG emissions. Again, we're talking about 320, Article 320 buildings. So what you see on the screen are the calculations to do that, and we'll walk through each factor within these calculations so you're able to determine where that comes from. So to determine the GHG emission limits in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, the building will have to be broken down into Energy Star portfolio manager property types and the corresponding gross floor area of that property type. Jean explained what the definition of gross floor area is. It's not the same as Department of Finance's definition of gross square feet. And in Rule 103-14, there's a corresponding emissions factor for each property type. So the building, when you're assessing a building, you break down each one of the property types by the gross floor area, and you multiply it by that emission factor that's either in the law or the rule. And you do that for each property type, you multiply them together, you add them up, and that's the emission limit for the building. So essentially every building will have a unique emissions limit because each building likely will not have the same gross floor area of each property type. So that's what we'll be seeing on the emission limit side. And just to note, those emission factors, every 5 years, they drop, with the most significant change happening between the first and second compliance periods. So starting in 2030, that's when those emission factors will drop significantly. And then to calculate the annual emissions of a building, you look at the annual fuel use of each fuel type and multiply it by the emissions coefficient that is in the rule or the law. So if you have electricity and natural gas, you look at the annual usage of electricity, multiply it by the emissions coefficient for the first compliance cycle from 2024 to 2029. You do the same for natural gas. You look at the annual fuel type of natural gas, multiply it by that emissions coefficient, so on and so forth if you have additional fuel types in the building. So you multiply those together, there's fuel type and emission coefficient, add them up, and that is the annual emissions. And so compliance is met if the emissions is less than or equal to the GHG emission limits. If the emissions is over, the annual emissions is over that limit, there is a penalty for non-compliance. So you would take that overage and multiply it by $268, and that would be the penalty. We have several penalty mitigation areas to go through, like good faith efforts and things like that, that are not covered in this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to walk through each one of those calculations. So we're talking, in this slide, we're talking about calculating the GHG emission limit. And remember, we were saying you have to look at a building as a whole and break it down into each, the previous slide said Energy Star portfolio manager property types. But in the law, if you go straight to Article 320, the law was originally written with building code occupancy categories, not Energy Star portfolio manager property types. So, so in the law, you'll see there's 17 different building code occupancy categories with corresponding building coefficients that are in there. If you look, you see at item 1, you have occupancy group A with the corresponding emissions factor. So one of the first, we'll go through in a couple of slides, that one of the first tasks that this unit did was translate all of those building code occupancy categories to Energy Star portfolio manager property types. It's important to note that these building code occupancy categories are based on life and safety, and different code requirements around these groups, and not necessarily energy usage intensity. Next slide, please. So in Rule 103-14, you'll see that we have a list of Energy Star portfolio manager property types and the corresponding emissions factor for the different compliance years. So highlighted on the screen here, you'll see the first compliance period, years 2024 to 2029, and the associated emissions factors for each one of those property types. There are 62 Energy Star portfolio manager property types that correspond to, the energy use intensity within the building. So when you're going through the building and you're breaking out the areas, it's important to think about the different energy use profiles of each different space and assign them accordingly. We'll go through an example. Jean will go through an example later in this presentation. But this is where it's important for the registered design professional, when they're doing these reporting, to think about which property types make sense in a building and when they need to be specifically broken out. So, if you're used to doing benchmarking, reporting on benchmarking, benchmarking really wants you to classify an entire building. They have rules around when you classify an entire building under one single property type. Sometimes you can do 2 property types, but with Local Law 97, we're looking at a more granular approach there. So it won't necessarily align with what has been reported for benchmarking. For example, if there's an office building with a large data center, that data center needs to be, obviously that will have a higher energy use intensity limit, and that should be called out separately since there's a higher emissions factor for the data center compared to an office space. So thinking about those different use profiles is really important when you're assigning these different property types. Next slide. So if you're interested on how we did the research and what the methodology was in converting those building occupancy categories into Energy Star Portfolio Manager property types. We have, you can find this report that's on our website. There's a link under the image on this in these slides, which you all will get a copy of. You can link directly to that report. There were a lot of outside stakeholders involved. It was very scientific methodology that was used to come up with, what those limits should be. And all of this was implemented in that first rule package that was effective January of 2023. Next slide. If you go into that report, here's just an example of one of the charts in the report, and it lists all of the ESPM property types. You'll see over on the left, the orange rows are property types that received a lower GHGI limit than what was in the original law, and compared to the occupancy groups. And the green indicates a higher limit. So you can see in this little snip of the table, medical offices and other services have a higher limit than what was in the original law. And then everything in white was just something, just hadn't changed. So you see multifamily housing, which we have large stock of here in New York City. That limit didn't change between the original law and moving to ESPM property types. So again, you can go through that. I'm not going to go through all the methodology during this presentation, but you're welcome to read the report and see how it evolved. Next slide. So what do you do when we have two options, right? We have Article 320 building code occupancy categories, and then we have the ESPM property types. How do you know which one to use? Well, we published a service notice in February of 2023 that explains how you should approach it. So basically what we're highlighting is in 103-14, we've said that all the limits must be, or you must use the ESPM property type limits to determine the building's limit rather than the occupancy groups. But there is one caveat. Next slide. The caveat is that if you have a building, so most of the, like we were saying, most of the Energy Star Portfolio Manager property types, when we did that transition, most of those limits are higher, meaning that they're more lenient under this ESPM approach than the building code occupancy category. However, some buildings have lower limits, which means they have a little bit more difficult time achieving compliance. So only in those cases where the emission limit was lowered under the Energy Star Portfolio Manager property type, these buildings have the option to choose whether they want to go what's in the original law with the building code occupancy category limits, or can choose the Energy Star Portfolio Manager property limits. They have that choice only for the first 2 years though. And then starting with calendar year 2026, when those reports are due in 2027, all buildings must start using the Energy Star Portfolio Manager coefficients. So, this gives a little bit of transition time if buildings need it. And then one other thing to caveat is that buildings cannot choose, pick and choose between both of those pathways. If they have the option to go one or the other pathway, they have to choose one or the other, and they can't, choose Energy Star Portfolio Manager property rights for part of the building and building occupancy categories for the other part of the building. Again, all that's detailed in our service notice. Next slide. And then this is just reiterating, this slide is just reiterating that starting calendar year 2026, reporting year 2027, all buildings must go with the ESPM property types that are listed in Rule 103-14. All right, and I'm going to pass it off to Jean now to walk us through some examples.
Thanks, Emily. So next slide, please. So Emily has been focusing on ESPM or occupancy types that determine buildings' emissions limit. Now let's look at the details of greenhouse gas emission coefficients for different fuel types. So these lists are the greenhouse gas emission coefficients when they consume this particular type of fuels for the compliance period 2024 through 2029. So you can just see the list there. And at the bottom, we have Article 320 section, just a direct excerpt of it. We can just, so what does this mean? Metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for instance, the item number 1, utility electricity. So 1 kilowatt hour electricity consumption results in 0.000288962 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emission. So that's what it means. So if you look at the list, maybe the pure oil number 4 has the highest coefficient. So it's mostly out of this, it's we would say more greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuel, and the next is fossil fuel for fuel oil number 2, and then next is, I believe, natural gas. District steam is slightly better, but then it's a different metric. But electricity is always a better emissions. I mean, it has a lower emissions coefficient. So if you electrify your buildings, your overall greenhouse gas emissions of the building will become lower. Can we have a next slide, please? Emily has gone over this, so I will be really brief. So buildings' annual greenhouse gas emission is basically the annual fuel use at the end of the year times the emissions coefficient of the fuel type. So they have to add them all up per different fuel type, and then the combined greenhouse gas emission. That's the building's annual greenhouse gas emissions. The compliance period has started this year, so it's already end of June. So we are currently at 6 months into the first calendar year of Local Law 97. Local Law 84 benchmarking has been the same covered building criteria of buildings over 25,000 square feet. So buildings over 25,000 square feet, that their annual fuel and water use have been reported already. So we are using the same annual fuel use data for Local Law 97. Can we have a next slide, please? So this is an example, what Emily explained and what I just talked about with the emissions coefficient. So let's take a look at the example. This example is a multifamily commercial mixed-use building of 45,000 gross floor area. It's not gross square feet from DOF, it's a gross floor area. To calculate this building's annual emission at the end of 2024, we look at their energy bill. So at the end of the year, the natural gas, if you look at the second column from the left, 2024 annual fuel use, natural gas was 2.25 million kBTU, and they are using dual oil for heating probably. So they have a oil use and they have a utility electricity at the bottom. So altogether, this annual fuel use has to be multiplied by each fuel type's emissions coefficient, and they multiplied, and at the far right hand column, that's the annual emissions of each fuel type. And we combine them, and at the end, 287 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the greenhouse gas emissions of the building over calendar year 2024. If you go to the middle, now let's see what's the emissions limit for this building. So this building is 40,000 square feet multifamily and 5,000 square feet commercial area. So the multifamily, we know there are dwelling units and there are some common space like lobby, corridor, stairwell, and they almost always have some back of the house spaces like mechanical room. Then they have some amenity space. The residency use only, like small fitness area, like bike storage. So all those small areas that supports the multifamily use, they are rolled into multifamily housing. housing in terms of the ESPN property type. So you don't have to break it down for multifamily housing, as long as they are just small amenity or small back of the house areas that supports the dwelling units. But the commercial use on the maybe street level, they have different retail stores. So you cannot call them all just one retail store. So if it is dry cleaner, it is a personal services, locksmith, there's a repair services, hardware store, yeah, we can call that retail store. And they have a different emissions factor. So basically that emissions factor for each different retail has to be multiplied by the gross floor area of the store. So at the far right column again, the 2024 emissions limit for multifamily is 270. The commercial is about maybe 32. So altogether, this building's 2024 emissions limit is 302 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So if you look at the bottom, for the calendar year 2024, this building's annual emissions were 287, but their emissions limit was 302. So emissions limit was greater than the actual emissions. So this building is compliant. It complies the local 97. So that was the sample calculation. And then can we have a next slide? So from this slide on, we're talking about, we already looked at the common fuel types, and there are greenhouse gas coefficients determined in our rules already for fuel cells 2024 to 2029. It's on here, Article 320 and rules. So the text at the bottom is Article 320, 3.1.1, Item 6. That's for fuel cell 2024 through 2029 compliance period. Next slide, please. Other fuels for the compliance period 2024 through 2029 are listed as Item 7 under Article 320. The other energy sources, DER technologies, they're listed here. And some more details are actually in the later promulgated RCNY 103-14. Next slide, please. For compliance period 2030 to 2034, we have greenhouse gas emissions coefficient listed in RCNY 103-14. So we won't go through all this individually. So you can always go to RCNY 103-14 for other fuel cells coefficient for further compliance period. Next slide, please. So to summarize, 70% of New York City electricity will be from renewable energy source by 2030. And New York State aims to achieve 100% renewable electricity by 2040. And then Con Ed has its greenhouse gas reduction goals for district steam. And if you look at the table, the grid electricity and district steam, because of that effort, the greenhouse gas coefficients are getting smaller over the compliance period. So if you see that the green text there, you're seeing the diminishing trend. As opposed to that, the natural gas, fuel oil 2, fuel number 4, they're fossil fuel, so their greenhouse gas coefficients are the same, so they will stay the same. So they will continue emit the greenhouse gas like they did. So that's the trend it shows. One thing that I forgot to mention, so there are like offsite solar, community solar, energy storage, biofuels, and cogen system. We have future rulemaking. It's on the way right now. So be in the lookout for the future rulemaking. About this table, Emily probably will explain further with the chart in the next slide. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jean. Next slide, please. So we're just going to wrap it up here. And this visual just shows what Jean was showing, just in a different format. That you can see based on the state's renewable energy goals for the grid, you can see in the yellow that electricity, the GHG coefficient, steeply reduces for each one of those, compliance cycles. So that is why you see all of the, a lot of the incentive work around electrification is, because of this trend of electricity going towards renewable. So that just ties in and kind of shows you, just a different visual of, why buildings that if they just continue to run on natural gas or fuel oil won't be able to reach the greenhouse gas reduction goals over time. They may be okay doing that in the first or second compliance period cycle, but once we get a little bit further and the emission limits really drop, it's going to be really difficult to achieve compliance without also shifting over to renewable energy, including the grid electricity that is anticipated to be renewable. Next slide. And this is just summary of everything that we covered, covering, how you calculate, again, the formulas for calculating the annual emissions, the GHG emission limits. And again, this is per building, not per lot. So that shift is happening in compliance. Each building needs to be considered, not each BBL. And, like we mentioned earlier, it's important to go through that exercise and determine which buildings on the BBL are subject to different compliance pathways. Again, compliance is met when the annual emissions is less than or equal to the limit. And just, strategies for getting there. We didn't go really into strategies, but, just high level. Obviously, if you reduce your fuel use, meaning you have more energy efficiency savings in your building, that's going to reduce emissions. If you reduce your fuel coefficient, you'll reduce your emissions. So, going back to that, graph, I think oil number 2 is the highest, natural gas is a little lower, but then electricity, and the district steam really decrease over time. So as we see those renewables enter into the grid with the offshore wind and the hydropower and, a lot of solar coming online, that electricity coefficient is going to, show, that's why it shows that it's dropping significantly. And then so starting in 2030, in that, compliance cycle, second compliance cycle, electricity will have the lowest coefficient. One of the items that was in the second rule package that was issued in December of 2023, we talked about beneficial electrification and why we're incentivizing that. This all ties into that, and that will be a topic of a future service provider training. So look out for that later in July or August. And next slide. I think that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Of a report for Local Law 97. And there was another question about when you have two different buildings on 2 different lots that are owned by 2 different parties, but they share an energy source, such as a cooling tower on one plant that supplies that building and the building on the other lot. Can you submit these as a campus? And the answer is no. In this case, if there are no separate meters or sub-meters, then there has to be an agreement between the 2 owners indicating how much fuel usage was consumed by each building, and the energy use of each building has to be arrived at mathematically through a methodology that's determined by a registered design professional and approved by the department. So we are at 12:01. I'd like to be conscious of people's time. Thank you for attending.